Folks, and welcome to Talking Pictures. This is a new series in which I want to talk about some of the paintings that I made, particularly from a period when I was in South Africa during the Mandela years and the transition into the new South Africa with the democratic changes that took place. And I arrived in South Africa in my early 20s, and my great dream was to be a painter. And I had to start out working in various jobs, doing odd jobs, doing part-time work, and at the same time trying to work towards um, my art practice. And as part of this, in the early 2000s, I took a year out to do a portfolio of artwork. And this painting, which I called The Emergency, is one of the early paintings that I made in this period. So we're looking back to probably somewhere around the 2000 mark. I can't remember the exact dates, but I'll try and find them and put them in the bio. And this painting, when I look back at it, shows to me really the turmoil and the uneasiness of that period, which at the time was hailed as such an incredibly transformative and in some ways quite coherent period, as Mandela came into power along with his cadre of ANC veterans who had been through places like Robben Island, in prison for decades, and who came into power with sweeping changes to the constitution and sweeping changes to the laws to make South Africa a deracialized, equal society, or at least try to make it. And at the time, there was a very interesting and, in some ways, trying to create coherence, a campaign called Simunye, which means we are one. And it's the idea being, as well with the Rainbow Nation, that South Africa was moving from being really a sort of black and white country with these stark contrasts and terrible racial policies, with their terrible legacy, which was being unpicked during the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, um, and the very painful processes underlying the transition to this new, supposedly more unified society. And I think what I look into this painting and see when I'm all these years on is that I've in some ways perceived how painful and how fragmented and how tumultuous this period was. There's a kind of vortex in the painting, and a strong binary opposition between the blue and the red, which creates this hot, cold kind of almost kind of like a waterfall against two different directions, one seeming to go up, the other seeming to go down. It's a kind of primary colored painting with the yellows and fading into some of the pinks and ochres, and purples. And there seems to be a kind of figure. A lot of this I did using an intuitive technique. I think this is really folk art. I think it's really naive art. I'm not a formally trained painter. I did A-level art at school in Britain, and then I really had to learn my craft through some lessons with some very good teachers, but short lessons, and through my own practices and looking at the works of painters. I particularly have always loved Van Gogh's work, along with so many other people. I've also loved the work of Matisse, and I think that the sort of powerful colours and evocative and sensual shapes come in some ways from both those painters. The marks I'm trying to make on the canvas are similar to the marks Van Gogh made, but there's possibly also a much more abstract modernist school work. Um, I don't know the modern abstract movement so well, but once you move into the sort of post-war periods in Europe in particular, you see this kind of move towards Picasso's initiated the Cubist movement, and then this kind of use of increasingly bold and really sort of diagrammatic almost shapes that evoke particular planes of thought or particular concepts. And I don't know where this sits because I think this painting to me, with its backdrop of a kind of almost cloud pink, is a sort of more kind of Renaissance picture in some ways. The figure walking into the plane on the right of the canvas, but moving to the left, looks very much like an African warrior, possibly a Ossa, one of the tribes in that region, who actually Mandela was one of the members of that clan of the Ossa people who he actually was in the royal house before he became a lawyer and then subsequently was imprisoned for his activities. Um, as is in the anti-apartheid movement. And there was a tremendous dignity about Mandela and stature. And I think for someone who grew up in Africa, the kind of the dignity that had adhered to many African people, particularly before the worst of the apartheid system had its impact on them. Was quite incredible. I mean, growing up in Zimbabwe, I remember the very dignified gentleman who would come to the house, and you would see at the Salisbury, later to be Harare show, wearing three-piece suits. Um, and then occasionally you still see um, traditional ceremonies where people are wearing the traditional dress. And this figure reminds me of the evoked, who are the initiates. I think it's at Apartheid in Isikosa, and they are the people who have been initiated into manhood when they are youths, and they wear a particularly traditional dress when they come out from that. Or perhaps that's the only time I've seen people wearing this kind of traditional African dress in South Africa, other than in televised pictures of the Zulu ceremonies. This looks to me like he's a warrior, and the other figures I see in the painting are a kind of bruised heart in the center, which I very much at that time was in a stage of life where my identity and my learning to embrace others and love and the young heart as it begins to feel into the world, but also having been quite battered by various experiences at the time and having to leave many things I loved in Britain to go to South Africa, where there were many things that I loved in Southern Africa too, and then particularly my family, but a very troubled time, a very sore time as well, I can see in this painting. And then when I look more closely, and if you turn the painting, because at one stage I was going to have this in portrait rather than landscape, and if you turn the painting on its side, it actually becomes another painting, and has several different figures, one being a kind of Trojan horse, which looks like it's being wheeled across the canvas in the blue section, which you can kind of make out if you can turn the frame of the painting. Um, and it's kind of being wheeled then across the top of this warrior who then recumbents, and then these words "we" and a kind of triangle appear in the bottom left-hand corner, which I think is a kind of evocation of this notion of simulye and who are we and what are we doing in this new South Africa? What were we trying to do? Um, and then there's all kinds of other potential strange shapes. There's a bird possibly which emerges out of the bottom right in green with a beak, and I think this is really part of the kind of intuitive approach that I was using in those times. The shapes, the broad strokes, the almost musical school style annotations, um, and then there is this cube in the in the one top corner. If it's portrait, it's in the top right corner, um, and um, this really is about, I think, what is in the sky, what is watching us, what are we exposed to in our new world. I think this is perhaps something that was to come back time and again in other themes, which was in my subsequent paintings, looking at the notion of being watched, the notion of what is in the sky, what is this eye in the sky, what is this um, object that we possibly revere in the sky, what is this notion of what is guiding us, benevolent or perhaps more sinister. Um, And so I think at this point I leave you to consider the painting more if you wish, to see what you wish. I didn't paint it necessarily with all these intentions. This is what I see all these many years on, over probably 25 years on since I painted the painting. And unfortunately, the painting is in quite a dilapidated state because of being moved and various things, and it would need restoration. So if you were interested in helping me to restore this painting, I'm going to set up a Patreon account, and I'll set up the details in the bio below. If you'd like to contribute, that would be fantastic. It would help me to get this painting restored. And thank you for listening, and I hope that I have brought you enjoyment and insight and helped to maybe touch upon a great period in history, which many people have probably heard about, but what did it actually feel like? This is what this painting, I think, evokes for me. Thank you very much. Goodbye.